The Ancient Kingdoms of Peru by Nigel Davies. Chapter 3. Nazca. Unsolved Enigmas. An astounding discovery. To the south of Lima, the Peruvian coastline becomes even more austere. The desert landscape is relieved only by a few river valleys, which present a lush contrast to the endless sand dunes. About 400 kilometers south of Lima lies an elevated plateau, situated 75 kilometers inland at an altitude of 500 meters, bounded on the north by the Rio Ichenio and on the south and west by the Rio Nazca. In contrast to the two river valleys, this stark stretch of brown pebbles, devoid of plant or animal life, is known as the Nazca Bomba. However, when first surveyed from an aircraft in 1926, this bleak expanse astounded its viewers. The Bomba was seen to be carpeted with man-made designs. These include highly realistic outlines of animals and plants. Interspersed between these more imaginative shapes, a plethora of straight lines were seen to fan out in all directions. Some of these ran for many miles. This discovery presented archaeologists with a formidable challenge, since none could offer any conceivable explanation as to why, at some time in antiquity, a stretch of bare desert had been thus elaborately adorned. The Nazca lines, henceforth treated as a new wonder of the American ancient world, have featured in countless magazines, in worldwide television shows, and in many books, including works on the occult. They became the source of endless speculation. Some favored the notion that the Nazcans somehow soared over the Pampa in a prehistoric form of glider or in hot air balloons, since from the ground level they could not have observed their work as we are able to do today. Among other theorists, Erich Von Daniken, the intrepid champion of extraterrestrial visits to Earth, entered the field. In his book, Chariots of the Gods, the lines are described as runways for craft from outer space, a notion already put forth by George Hunt Williamson in his book, Road in the Sky, which contained a chapter on Nazca entitled Beacons for the Gods. Von Daniken, who acquired an immense following, intrigued by his insistence on the extraterrestrial origins of human civilization, tends to seek, like Faust, one answer to every question. For this author, every shaven head on a statue is really a spaceman's helmet, every outstretched hand is describing as clutching a spaceship's lever, and every stylized moth becomes an aircraft. Not content with the notion that the prophet Ezekiel saw and described a spacecraft, he even proclaimed that certain birds and insects in the Gold Museum of Bogota are really extraterrestrial aircraft. Perhaps, therefore, it is hardly surprising that in Chariots of the Gods, the author reproduced a photo from Nazca that he describes as depicting parking bays, resembling those of a modern airport. But he failed to perceive that such markings in fact represented the right knee and foreclaws that form one part of the outline of a giant bird. When directly challenged and confronted with a complete drawing of this bird in a BBC television film, also shown in the United States, he for once admitted that he had erred and that his picture of parking bays was a mistake. But he merely modified his stance, and in another book, Return to the Stars, he again claimed that space visitors had used Nazca as an improvised airport. In fairness to Von Daniken, it must be stated that other writers have also indulged in such far-fetched notions. For instance, Jim Woodman, to prove the existence of prehistoric balloons in his book Nazca, Journey to the Sun, tells how he himself piloted a crude hot air balloon over the Pampa in 1975. The balloon was constructed from materials found in ancient times in shrouds taken from Nazca graves. In 1983, a Swiss author, Henry Sterlin, produced an even odder theory, insisting that the Nazca lines were somehow connected with textile workshops and hence with the making of the huge burial shrouds that formed part of the Nazca culture. In seeking more plausible solutions, one is first struck by the bleakness of the setting. In contrast to the lush valley of the Rio Nazca, lying to the south, the Pampa on which the lines are drawn is almost totally arid. Over a 9-year period between 1957 and 1965, the average precipitation was measured at 4.53 millimeters per annum. In 6 of these 9 years, annual rainfall was less than 2 millimeters. No studies have been made of the climate that might have prevailed in earlier times when the first lines were presumably created, but data from other parts of the coast of southern Peru suggest that there have been no major changes in the last few thousand years. Viewed from the air, the Nazca lines present a confused picture, intersecting each other in such a way as to give an impression not unlike the remains of an unerased blackboard at the end of a busy day of classroom activities. The Pampa surface reveals details of countless figures that overlap each other. Clearly, therefore, a great deal of human effort must have been devoted to their creation, probably stretching over a fairly long period of time. The forms represented consist on the one hand of straight lines, rectangles, spirals, and trapezoids. But apart from these straight lines and spirals, other designs illustrate plants and animals, including fish, birds, a monkey, and a spider, as well as other creatures that are harder to identify. Most animals are on a fairly small scale, as compared with the immense length and complexity of some lines. Only a few of the animals are large, such as a huge spider and a bird whose outline extends for 300 meters. In general, straight lines dominate. Apart from these lines and zigzags, there are also more than 100 spiral forms, some of which are of an extraordinary complexity. A few most unusual designs have been noted, including a peculiar 5-armed paddle wheel. While the animal figures are localized in one area, they are significant as a mode of artistic expression. Forms such as those of a killer whale, a lizard, and a frigate bird are very similar to those found on Nazca Ceramics. Nazca, its people and their art. Much has been written on the Nazca lines and on the purposes which they might have served, but it becomes hard to consider such questions unless one first studies the culture and antecedents of the people who presumably created them. As Anthony Aveni observes in his major work on Nazca, Order in the Nazca Lines, too little discussion of Nazca origins, and hence of the earlier cultures on the south coast of Peru, appears in the literature about the lines, concerning which basic questions required to be asked in a pan-Indian framework. It is important to note that comparatively early studies, such as those of the Columbia University expedition of 1952, describe Nazca culture as springing from the much earlier style of Paracas, a peninsula situated some 160 kilometers from the northwest of Nazca, with which it shares comparable climate. Shortly after the turn of this century, magnificent textiles began to appear in collections in Peru and Europe. Well preserved and richly embroidered, they attracted much attention, though their provenance was unclear. The source of these garments was first identified in the late 1920s, when Julio Tello visited the Paracas Peninsula. Similar textiles were excavated from burials in 3 zones named cavernas, Arena Blanca and Necropolis. These cemeteries were the work of people who are now known to have lived in Paracas from approximately 600 to 175 BC. The principal burials, those of the necropolis, cover a span of almost 300 years, from 475 to 175 BC. Decorated bowls and bottles from Paracas bear a distinct relationship to the final phase of the Chavin culture, Hanabarriu, probably dating from about 400 to 200 BC. The people of Paracas were most versatile and produced not only pottery but finely worked stone clubs, obsidian knives, shell and bone necklaces, together with hammered gold ornaments and fine feather fans. Anne Paul, a leading authority on Paracas, describes the people's leaders as dressed in magnificent woven apparel, embellished with images embroidered in vivid colors. These fine outer garments concealed decorated tunics, ponchos, and skirts. When each chief died, he was carefully wrapped with precious garments worn in life and with other textiles offered as gifts. The burial bundles were interred in a large necropolis cemetery. Such bundles formed the main record of Paracas culture. The necropolis contained 429 bundles. Under Julio Tello's supervision, over 40 of the largest were unwrapped and are housed in the National Museum of Anthropology and Archaeology in Lima. Moved from one depository to another, flooded by rainwater, eaten by insects, and ravaged by the damp Lima climate, many have suffered more damage in the past 60 years than in the previous 2,000. Incidentally, 6 of the largest bundles were loaned to the Ibero-American Exposition in Seville in 1929 and never returned. Nonetheless, enough of these splendid remains have survived to enable Anne Paul to write a most explicit book, published in 1990 on Paracas ritual attire, replete with fine illustrations. The text describes certain Paracas textiles as deriving from the earliest motifs of the Nazca Ica region. The Nazca culture may be viewed in many respects as the direct successor of the Paracas, since it flourished from about 200 BC to AD 600. In Nazca, Pottery, rather than weaving, became the paramount art form. Nazca embroidery was simpler and less refined. The painted images, however, clearly display many of the themes that figured in the Paracas textiles. The Gothenburg Ethnographic Museum of Sweden has a unique collection of pots that illustrate the typical themes of the Nazca style. A frequent and strange image portrays a man standing frontally, out of whose mouth emerges a serpent tongue that ends in one or sometimes two trophy heads. The man has an elaborate headdress, consisting either of weird animals or of another human face. Other Nazca pots display features more directly derived from Paracas, such as a figure bearing a winged forehead badge with a trailing appendage, accompanied by severed human heads, a dominant Paracas theme. At a more docile striped cat-like creature appears, that often clutches fruit or vegetables, obviously symbols of fertility. Some early Nazca pots portray unique images of beans or peppers. A peculiar feature of this Nazca culture, whose potters developed such refined skills, is that it was based on no major centers of population comparable, say, to those of the Moche, let alone the monumental site of later date at Chanchan. It seems that Nazca pots were produced in a number of smaller settlements spread over a fairly wide area. Notwithstanding certain local variations, the basic themes were simply repeated from one valley to the next. We find no large and complex ruins in the area, suggestive of the existence of some kind of Nazca empire, and no traces exist of storage facilities and administrative buildings more typical of a conquest state. Instead, the evidence suggests that the Nazca peoples were simply scattered across a series of semi-fertile valleys. Cahuachi. As a partial exception to this demographic pattern, the fairly large site of Cahuachi, lying to the west of the settlement of Nazca itself, may be cited. It had previously been suggested that Cahuachi was an aggressive and even militaristic center, based on the numerous pots displaying severed heads, together with actual human heads dug up within the site. More recently, intensive field work has been carried out by Helene Silverman, described in a massive book on Cahuachi published in 1993. While the author stresses that Cahuachi, which flourished from about 81 to 750, is by far the largest known site of the Nazca culture, she lends no support to notions of a site as a strictly urban center. In 85% of its total area, there is no evidence of residential occupation. The remaining 15% consists of lightly modified hills which constitute Cahuachi's only form of monumental construction. The 40 semi-artificial mounds of varying size and form seem to serve ceremonial rather than domestic purposes. Only a single intact temple precinct was discovered on one small mound. As a group of scattered sacred points on a profane landscape, Cahuachi itself became sacred more by the nature of the rites performed than by the presence of impressive monuments. Silverman, moreover, does not see the site as having attained the commercial significance of certain other pilgrimage centers, in particular Pachacamac. There are few storage facilities and material goods brought thither that were rapidly consumed. Hence, Cahuachi conveys the impression of a ceremonial center that could either be bustling with activity or virtually depopulated, depending on the day. The same author suggests that such activities might imply the ritual consumption of fair amounts of Nazca pottery. The role of Cahuachi is perhaps less to be compared to that of Pachacamac than to the modern pilgrimage shrine at Yauca in the Ica Valley, some 190 kilometers to the north, known as the Sanctuary of the Virgin of the Rosary of Yauca. It is used occasionally rather than continuously, and it would appear that Cahuachi, like Yauca, lacked a residential population of any size. For the Festival of the Virgin, thousands of peasants remain camped outside the plaza area of Yauca, itself transformed into a great market with close-packed kiosks. A few days later, the site may be abandoned and the quote-unquote city dismembered almost as quickly as it was installed. Of notable significance was the discovery by Silverman of many trophy heads, so abundantly illustrated in early Nazca pottery. One such head wore an elaborately braided coiffure. In another, a carrying cord emerges from a hole in the frontal bone. On the basis of mortuary remains collected in Cahuachi and other places, she suggests that approximately 5% of the whole Nazca population ended up as trophy heads or headless bodies. Scores of smaller domestic sites contemporary with Cahuachi have been discovered, most of which are under 4 hectares in size. Only one, Ventilla, is larger and covers 200 hectares. Hence, in considering the socio-political context of the famous Nazca style, early notions of Kawachi as the capital of a centralized state, let alone a militaristic empire, become even harder to accept. In Nazca pottery, no social hierarchy is clearly illustrated, as for example in moche art. Kawachi and other early Nazca sites are to be seen more as a kind of interacting group of separate societies linked by a shared religious tradition. The possibility is not totally to be excluded from some kind of formal chiefdom in which paramountcy might have rotated, but with Kawachi as its seat. However, the absence of residential or administrative constructions at that site would make the existence of even such a broad-based chiefdom seem highly questionable. No simple answers. In the early 1930s, many fights were made over the Nazca Bomba, and the notion thus tended to prevail that the lines could only be appreciated and understood when thus seen from above. Such flights attracted much attention, but apart from a brief study by Mejia Chespi, a well-known Peruvian archaeologist, published in 1939, the first person to seek more concrete conclusions was Paul Kosok, a New Yorker with wide-ranging interests. At one time, he had been a conductor of the Brooklyn Civic Orchestra. Kosok's visit to Nazca took place in 1941, and in his brief season of research, he studied a series of lines and several large rectangular shapes, together with a strange, stylized image of a bird. He became convinced at this early stage that the lines had some astronomical significance. Kosok did not return to Nazca until 1948. He then worked there for some time, though his principal book, Life, Land, and Water in Ancient Peru, did not appear until 1965. His research was continued by Maria Reich, a German mathematics teacher who had already worked with Julio Tello at the Paracas site. Ritchie agreed to take over the detailed study of Kosok's drawings, and during the following period spent as many hours each year in Nazca as she could afford. For the remainder of her time, she worked in a tea shop in Lima. She used to stay in an old hotel in the town of Nazca, getting up at 3 a.m. to hitch a ride from trucks that passed along the Pan-American Highway. This remarkable woman devoted her whole life to the enigma of Nazca. Apart from a much-publicized television film, Mystery on the Desert, she wrote several books and many articles on the subject. In the earlier years of her long sojourn, she was largely ignored by the local people, who assumed that she was a kind of mad witch. They themselves at this stage had little awareness of the desert markings because they are so difficult to view from the ground. Standing on a 2-meter ladder, Reich could recognize not only the spirals and trapezoids. She also identified animal figures, such as the killer whale and a giant bird that resembled a condor. But she was even more struck by a figure recognizable as a monkey that measured 80 meters from head to tail. Since such animals were unknown in the Nazca Valley and do not appear on its painted pots, this posed a further puzzle. Convinced that the figure must also be of astronomical significance, she claimed that at the time when the lines were drawn, the form of a monkey could have been seen in the sky, made up from various stars, including the Great Bear. On checking the compass angles of the straight lines near the monkey drawing, she found a long track that pointed to the star Benet Nash, as it would have risen above the horizon in about the year AD 1000. This star is at the tip of the tail, or handle, of the Great Bear constellation. Though for many years Reich was thus left to pursue her studies in comparative tranquility, all this was to change as Nazca came to be the object of a massive burst of publicity, particularly after the publication in 1968 of Von Daniken's book, depicting Nazca as a landing ground for spaceships. The Pampa was invaded overnight with cars, motorcycles, and even trekkers with donkeys. Both Kosok and Reich had become obsessed with the notion that the main significance of the lines was astronomical. Kosok based his contention on a study of social developments, which he associated with early Nazca times. He argued that any group that developed an elaborate agricultural system would require some understanding of astronomy, since the annual progress of the seasons was related to the movements of the stars, a process the precise nature of which could only be fathomed by a class of astronomer priests. Hence, the lines were seemingly connected with methods of determining the relevant calendar dates. Writing in more detail on the same theme, Reich, to quote one example, cited the azimuth range of 68 degrees 15 feet to 70 degrees 10 feet, stating that the Pleiades and Scorpio rose in this direction in AD 500-700 at the latitude of Nazca. Within this interval of 68 degrees to 70 degrees, Reich backed her conclusions by citing various of her line measurements, including one side of a triangle, 4 scattered lines, and 16 zigzag segments of one single feature. Though, as we shall see, astronomical solutions to the Nazca puzzle have since tended to be questioned, they still retain a certain influence. Scholars who have written more recently on these subjects, such as Johann Reinhard, concur with other specialists that at least a few of the lines might have played a role in making astronomical observations. Reinhard himself, while admitting that the lines pose a problem for which there can be no single solution, was attracted above all by the notion that the triangles and trapezoid lines were somehow intended to draw down moisture from the foothills of the Andes to the east of Nazca. Nazca and Stonehenge. Following the work of Cossack and of Reich, whose principal work, Mystery on the Desert, was first published in 1948, many questions remain unanswered, notwithstanding her firm adherence to astronomical explanations. It was not until 1968 that the astronomer Gerald Hawkins entered the field. In 1963, Hawkins had caused a sensation in the academic world when he published a paper, Stonehenge Decoded, in the British journal Nature. To test his theory, he drew lines between pairs of stones, pits, and posts, which were then fed into a computer. At first, many scientists questioned his conclusion that the layout of the famous site, built some 5,000 years ago on the Salisbury Plain, might be connected with stellar observations. However, his theory did come to achieve a measure of scientific acceptance, and today few scholars doubt that the builders of Stonehenge were aware of the major cycles of the sun and moon. Hawkins adopted the same approach to the problem of Nazca. With the help of cartographers at the Peruvian Geophysical Institute, he first plotted a highly accurate map based on air photos. After having measured the direction of all the lines, he ran a similar computer program to that of Stonehenge, comparing the many different alignments with the movements of the sun, moon, and stars along the horizon. But of all the 186 possible alignments which Hawkins selected, only a very limited number correspond with the angles of the sun and moon to within a margin of 1 degree on either side. The remainder ran to all points of the compass, though a few pointed to a very mixed bag of heavenly bodies, including certain rather faint stars. But since Hawkins was convinced that the astronomical theory could only be accepted if the lines pointed to a clear pattern of celestial events, he concluded that the methods applied to Stonehenge were invalid in the case of Nazca. Further computer tests affirmed his view, and the astronomical theory was pronounced by Hawkins as dead. Following his investigations, the general opinion had prevailed among specialists that only a few Nazca lines might have played a role in making astronomical observations. New approaches. Since Hawkins' outright rejection of the lifelong conviction of Cossack and Maria Reich that the Nazca lines were basically astronomical, countless scholars have entered the field, though none has so far offered any single explanation that is wholly convincing. Each tends to emphasize some particular aspect of the problem without attempting to devise a more definitive overall solution. Among such writers, one may cite Toni Morrison, a British filmmaker who wrote much on the subject in the 1970s, including a book, Pathways to the Gods, that attracted considerable attention. He was much influenced by the work of the French anthropologist Alfred Metro, who as early as 1934 had described pathways made by the Chipaya Indians of Bolivia, who built many small shrines scattered in long rows at distances of up to 10 miles from a village. What impressed Metro most of all were straight lines or pathways cut through the vegetation that converged on such isolated shrines like spokes on a wheel. Morrison led an expedition to Bolivia, where he was surprised to see lines running for over 30 kilometers on the slopes of Sajama, one of the highest mountains of Bolivia. He eventually reached the village of Sajama, lying at a height of 4,250 meters. Here, too, he found straight paths leading in every direction, usually running up from churches to small villages. While these lines were quite different in construction to those of Nazca, Morrison's work served to draw attention to the possible ceremonial, as opposed to astronomical, functions of the Nazca lines. Working in the 1980s, the anthropologist Johann Reinhard further explored the possible use of the Nazca lines for ceremonial purposes. Working in the even more remote deserts of northern Chile, he discovered a strange cluster of drawings on a hill known as Cerro Unidas that recalled those of Nazca. A series of straight lines run up the cerro, each of which ends in a cairn near the summit. He thus clearly established an example of lines that served as sacred pathways to the shrines of Andean deities. a phenomenon that he linked with the need for water in arid regions. However, in recent times, the most comprehensive work on the Nazca lines is surely that of Anthony Aveni, who edited Order of the Nazca Lines, published in 1990, describing his own work and also containing articles by other distinguished scholars. As Aveni remarks, on reviewing the relevant literature, he was surprised to learn that only a handful of investigators had ever ventured into the desolate surface of the Pampa to look at the lines close up. He questions whether people had become too rigidly accustomed to view it from the air, the method by which the lines were discovered by those who flew over them in the 1920s, and asks whether the notion that they were meant to be seen from above had become an established dogma. Aveni further draws attention to the fact that a close study of the archaeological remains on the surface of the Pampa, as opposed to lines seen mainly from the air, is vital to any understanding of why the lines were made. In reviewing past studies, he realized that no one had ever undertaken a thorough examination of the surface on which the lines and figures were drawn. An exception to Aveni's observation on this point is the work of Percy Clarkson, of whom an article is included in Aveni's book. Gerald Hawkins had gathered some pottery fragments from 3 strips of the Pampa surface. Most of the shards that he collected dated from the relatively early periods, known as Nazca 3 and 4, approximately 100 BC to AD 100. But such evidence used as a method of dating the lines conflicts notably with Clarkson's ground-level investigation of a different and much more intensive area of lines. She found very few shards associated with this early period, and their presence cannot logically be taken as sure evidence that the makers of this pottery constructed the lines. Clarkson further points out that the surface geoglyphs illustrating birds and other animals are not necessarily contemporary with the finest Nazca ceramics, even if these glyphs illustrate birds and lizards of a kind that figure in this pottery. Somewhat surprisingly, in the vicinity of many geoglyphs, more pottery was found dating from a much later era, known as the Middle Horizon or Wadi period, running from about 8600 to 1000. However, as Clarkson observes, if these geoglyphs were really made during the Wadi period, they bear little relationship to the very different concepts and motifs that then prevailed. Aveni's account of his investigations first presents a copious review of every kind of previous study of the Nazca lines, some of which have been described above. He pays due tribute to the tireless work of Maria Reich and describes some of her discoveries as tantalizing, if inexplicable. For instance, she discovered that in measuring trapezoids, lengths of 32.6 meters, and its double occur frequently, as also do several doubles of 26.7 meters, a measurement that is cited in 10 instances. Aveni even goes to great lengths to examine certain of Reich's involved calculations, such as her analysis of the abdomen of a spider figure formed by a dozen segments that can somehow be tied to the cycle of lunar phases. He felt compelled, however, to conclude that such an analysis is quite arbitrary and is linked to no information about the culture that produced it. He concludes by stating that considerations of precise geometry contained within the Nazca lines are indeed tantalizing but inconclusive. He even includes an appendix on the Cantelloch spiral design that forms part of a much larger figure, but the results of his study prove basically negative, though he admits that the analysis of a single spiral should not close the door to further discussion. In another context, he states that stellar alignments and astronomy, though now largely discounted, may nevertheless be faintly present. One of Aveni's main themes is an insistence that the lines were made to be walked upon. He mentions in this context an ingenious but not well-known study by the archaeologist H. Horgenheimer, published in 1947. This Peruvian investigator considered that the trapezoids were indeed as places of assembly for sacred reunions of cults of the dead, while these sacred dances that were performed might also be related to worship of the dead. Aveni further cites among the more imaginative explanations the theory of G. von Breunig, expressed in his 1980 publication Nazca, a pre-Columbian Olympic site. As the title implies, the author proposed that the lines might have been constructed for the purpose of running competitive races. While this idea may appear odd at first glance, plenty of evidence does exist that ritual walking, running, or dancing were important in ancient Peru. For von Breunig, however, the running theory surely enters the realm of fantasy when he proposes that the lines first served for local races that culminated in a form of national games with athletically garbed participants, all supposedly to be found on Nazca pottery. Before reviewing Avini's comments on the vast network of straight lines, it may be useful first to consider the rather inexplicable geometrical figures formed by certain lines. Avini's survey revealed a total of 227 such figures that cover a greater area of the Pampa than the straight lines, together with the animal and plant designs. Such geometrical figures are triangles and rectangles, though the term trapezoid usually serves to designate them all. The figures are very large, and 24 of them cover areas larger than 45,000 square meters. Four-sided square trapezoids comprise 62% of all geometrical figures examined, while triangles form 27% of the total. Rectangles make up only 9% of the sample. The purpose of such forms is hard to explain, but the suggestion is made that the builders may have intended to establish some sense of local orientation with respect to water flow, a subject that will be treated in more detail below. The purpose of the animal and plant figures may be even harder to explain. Some 3 dozen examples of these biomorphic Nazca figures are almost all located in a relatively small area of the Pampa. They also may have been intended to be walked upon rather than viewed from on high. While it has been suggested that the animal and geometrical figures are related, Aveni inclines to the view that they may represent activities undertaken by entirely different groups of people at different times. In this respect, it may be worth noting that, though many of the animal species etched on the Pampa can also be found on typical Nazca ceramics, dating from about 200 BC to AD 600, as we have seen above, the shards found near these zooglyphs mostly belong to a later period. A major conclusion. By walking upon the Pampa and taking careful measurements, Aveni reached a new conclusion of major significance. As he observes, while so much attention has been devoted to the animal and plant figures, the width and length of the vast network of lines had scarcely been tabulated by modern investigators, although far more manpower and planning had been devoted in ancient times to these straight features. Many photographs indicated clearly that interconnecting patterns of lines could be identified. Moreover, certain of Rex's maps contained lines that seemed to converge on what she had called star-like centers or networks. Using an enlargement of one of these maps and removing from the enlargement all features other than the straight lines, Aveni and Gary Urton studied a 50 square kilometer strip of the desert bordering on the south bank of the Rio Eugenio Valley, which constitutes the northern extremity of the area marked by lines, and were able to identify 4 specific points from which a total of 88 lines emanated or converged in a spoke pattern. Not a single line could be found that did not connect to one of these focal points. Subsequently, they walked over some lines in the same area that were directed towards other star-like focal centers on the other side of the Pampa. Previous studies of the lines from ground-based research have been rare and offered little detailed information. In contrast, Aveni and Urton spent long periods of time walking the lines, in many cases as far as their termination point. Having studied the 4 spoke patterns already explored, they examined the area to the south, bordering on the Rio Nazca Valley, and discovered a further 5 focal line centers. They soon realized that these line centers had certain common features. They all consisted of a group of natural hills or mounds, and most are located in that part of the Pampa where the last hill can be seen to descend from the higher mountains. These hills were nearly all situated along the elevated rim of the Pampa that borders the principal rivers and their tributaries. Few line centers were found in the middle of the Pampa. In all, 762 lines were tabulated, emanating from 62 focal centers. Of these, 224 lines were classified as broad and 538 as narrow. The average traceable length of a line from its center is 13 kilometers. The longest is over 19 kilometers. Only one single line was found that was not demonstrably tied to one of the 62 centers. While no one has challenged the demonstrable layout of the lines in the spoke pattern, converging on identifiable centers, the discovery in itself does not reveal the ends which they served. The principal purposes currently proposed are related to ritual walking, to water supplies, and to the division of the territory into clear strips. While Aveni himself insists that the lines were intended to be walked along, the people of the Pampa would have had to have been indefatigable walkers to require 762 lines for mere peregrination, though Gawachi was undoubtedly an important place of pilgrimage to judge by its material remains. Equally, the use of the lines to serve as divisional boundaries may seem questionable due to their extreme complexity. Some connection of the lines with the quest for water would seem logical in view of the stress laid by Aveni and others on the fact that water constitutes the most important commodity in the Nazca community. The Pampa is bordered by two tributaries of the Rio Grande, the Rio Ingenio and the Rio Nazca. Gullies cutting across the Pampa drain water from the high Andes into this narrow strip, lying between the Andes and the Pacific Ocean, where it almost never rains, a process in the course of which the precious liquid plummets from 3,000 meters to sea level. Many lines on close examination appear to have been established along the two rivers and their tributaries that pass from the mountains onto the Pampa. A number of lines converged on centers that seem to have been deliberately located within view of tributaries that connect the main Pampa with the river valleys. For reasons that are not altogether clear, such centers are tied exclusively to the Rio Nazca, including those located nearer to the Rio Ingenio, lying to the north of the lines. There is a high concentration of centers on the north bank of the Rio Nazca immediately opposite Itahuachi. Somewhat paradoxically, though ethnographic studies of the region suggest that Cerro Blanco, elevation 2,078 meters, visible from much of the Pampa, was important in local rites for inducing the rains and was worshipped as a means of providing water, from centers situated nearest to Cerro Blanco, not a single line is oriented to within 5 degrees of that peak. Nonetheless, Aveni, having studied a great deal other possibilities, including explanations based on astronomy, adheres to the view that while the evidence may as yet be far from conclusive, the one dominant commodity that correlates with his data on the focal line centers is water, so vital to the region. The location of all 62 line centers along the major rivers or very near to tributaries is far too consistent to be coincidental. Further comparisons. The temptation may arise to view the Nazca lines as a unique phenomenon without comparison in Peru or elsewhere. But, as we have seen above, Alfred Metro, working in Bolivia in 1934, had already discovered pathways leading up to countless small shrines made by the Chipaya Indians. He describes such pathways as converging on isolated shrines like spokes on a wheel, somewhat recalling Aveni's mapping of the Nazca lines. One may equally mention Reinhardt's discovery of a comparable phenomenon in the North Chilean desert. Aveni even draws attention to parallels between the Nazca lines and the long straight roads that radiated from the Inca capital, Cusco. Inexplicably certain of these roads suddenly widened, changed course, and assumed a partially trapezoid form. Comparisons have also been proposed between the lines and the Inca Seque system. Seque is the Quechua word for line. According to the chronicler Bernabe Cobo, the Seque system of Cusco consisted of 4 lines or seques radiating from the Temple of the Sun in Cusco. Along these seques, 328 holy sites or huacas were situated. Tom Zuidema, who spent many years of research on the subject, states that the majority of these seques were not actual pathways and could not be clearly identified on the ground. Rather, the Incas conceived them as invisible connections between these sacred huacas scattered along their length, but often not precisely situated on the straight course of a line. However, seques were also connected with certain forms of human sacrifice, and victims, particularly children, were compelled to follow a straight line trace for the purpose along the course of a seque to reach their place of sacrifice. It is important also to note that certain other seques clearly do not begin at the Temple of the Sun in Cusco, and hence in a sense more than one unified system existed. The 328 huacas, according to Zuidema's interpretation, consisted of temples, arrangement of stones, or even certain trees. It is most significant that some were connected with springs and other natural wells. In many cases, the water theme and its association with the Inca agricultural calendar is much in evidence. For instance, one seque of the Chinchasuyu quadrant of Cusco, known as Sucana, was a hill by way of which the water channel from Chinchero reached the city. Other seque lines were associated with bends in rivers, and certain rituals associated with the seque system stressed the relationship between people and water. The seque system, in turn, has been compared with the image of the Quipu, the use of which served as a substitute for writing as a means of keeping records, used by the Incas and certain other Andean peoples. The Quipu consisted of a thick cotton cord from which were suspended many thinner cords, each containing clusters of knots. If a quipu is spread out on a flat surface, it can easily be noted that it resembles the plan of the seques, since the cords of the quipu radiate outwards in every direction, like the seque lines. The quipu was fundamental to the whole system of control of the Inca Empire, as we shall later see, and though we cannot now interpret the surviving quipus, the records confirm that they were able to register an almost incredible amount of data. The Unsolved Mystery. As Johann Reinhard rightly observes, the vast pattern of Nazca lines, trapezoids, and geoglyphs captures our attention all above because no simple explanation exists as to their origins or purpose. Probably we shall never reach a precise conclusion as to their meaning or to the purpose that they served. They could even have had uses of which we are totally unaware. Further research may help to clarify the general problem and the many unanswered questions that arise. For instance, the prehistoric climate of the Nazca region is still poorly known at the present time. Equally, opinions still differ as to whether the lines and the geoglyphs are contemporary or belong to two different cultural horizons. Persis Clarkson, as we have seen, is convinced that the geoglyphs are not necessarily contemporary with the basic Nazca culture, generally associated with the lines, and discusses the possibility that they might belong more to the following period, the Middle Horizon, which began in about AD 600, though relatively few shards from that era have been found in their vicinity. At all events, it would seem that the creation of all the lines and glyphs was extended over a period of time. It should be added that the Nazca itself, distinguished for its pottery, continued to retain a certain significance as a major supplier of cotton for textiles. While the astronomical significance of the lines now tends to be discounted, Aveni, Urton, and others have argued cogently that they were closely connected with rites associated with the crucial importance of water supplies, and that, as such, were meant to be trod upon. Parallels exist in other civilizations. The ancient Egyptians climbed up onto the dry desert to conduct specific rituals. But the Nazca lines are essentially a part of a continuous trait of Andean cultures in which a mythical devotion to patterns of straight lines, found also in the deserts of Bolivia and Chile, is deep-rooted and played a role that has no precise comparison in other parts of the globe. Far from being a practice confined to a particular era or region, the linear concept can thus be seen as a notable feature of pre-Hispanic Andean culture. The Inca road system might even be cited as relevant to this concept, involving, in some cases, the expansion of roads built in the Nazca area long before. This concludes Chapter 3.